Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fully Mindful podcast, where we delve into what it truly means to embody mindfulness and presence in our daily lives while uncovering our intrinsic worth and purpose. I'm your host, Melissa Chareau. I'm a neurodivergent lawyer, mindfulness teacher, and embodiment and breathwork coach. On the Fully Mindful, we have candid conversations with inspiring creatives, wellness leaders, social disruptors, authors, all exploring how they've discovered their purposes and cultivated a mindful, connected existence. So I'm excited today that we have the privilege of hosting Yvonne Caputo, a lifelong storyteller whose narrative journey embodies the essence of mindfulness. From her diverse roles as a teacher, psychotherapist, consultant, Yvonne has harnessed the power of storytelling to awaken hearts and minds. In her book, Flying with Dad, and its sequel, Dying with Dad, she offers profound insights into the human experience, navigating relationships and honoring loved ones' wishes. Throughout our conversation, we're going to explore, I hope, Yvonne's unique perspective on the books that she has written, her relationship with her father, on death and dying, and her personal process and journey. So join us as we uncover the transformative power of storytelling and mindfulness with Yvonne Caputo on the Fully Mindful. So welcome, Yvonne.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's really good to have you. And I'm excited to have you as someone myself who comes from a background of, well, I was a wannabe storyteller. I went to University of California at Berkeley and graduated with an English literature degree with which I did nothing, but very much enjoy and am inspired by those of us who are able to tell stories and able to convey great meaning through our stories. So I'm wondering if you can share with us how your background as a teacher and a psychotherapist and all your other experiences has influenced your approach in life, and then maybe how, and we'll get into your books in a little bit, but how you approach your books.
I learned very early on as an elementary school teacher that the education was in the story. It wasn't in the book. It wasn't in the activity necessarily, but where I would capture my students' attention would be when I would tell stories.
Mhm.
And that's where it really started for me. And then when I decided to go back and get the second master's degree in clinical psychology, listening to clients, it's in their story.
Mhm.
It's in their story in terms of joys and concerns and hurts and processes and life skills and where they want to go and what they want to do. So there's always this theme of story in everything that I've done. And then going from there to a retirement community. And of course, with the elderly, it was in their story, you
Mhm.
know, what had been meaningful to them, why they moved into a retirement community, how they wanted to maintain their life, or very interestingly, that they would stop in my office and say, Yvonne, I want to go.
Mhm.
And I would say, tell me. So listening to stories in all of the aspects of my career, not only the telling, but being present and listening.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's the most important aspect of really connecting with another human being, is that being present and for their story and witnessing what they want to be witnessed,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes me think of way back when I was teaching very bright kids. And I can still see this young lady's face as she sat on the top of the desk, her desk. We were all by ourselves. And she said to me, I don't know why I exist.
Hmm.
I don't know of what value my life has or what it will have. a 12-year-old going through an existential crisis.
Yeah.
So we talked about that. So in those worries of hers, she gave me her story.
Hmm.
So listening for those kinds of cues, and it came, from everywhere, from 12-year-olds and younger than that,
Yeah.
and from older people. It was always in the story.
We all have stories, and we have stories that we tell ourselves. We have stories that we tell others, and sometimes they're very different from one another. And just being able to be present and hear the real story that someone is trying to communicate is so valuable to both, right? Because that's where the connection happens. And speaking of which, I want to get into your book, your first book, Flying with Dad, which is deeply personal and emotional because it ultimately is about your connection with your father and how that came to be. Can you share with us how the idea of this book unfurled or presented itself to you?
So my father and I had a fairly decent relationship, but it wasn't the one I wanted.
Mm.
There was a roof over my head growing up. There was food on the table. He was always there at night, just right down the hall. But to have the kinds of conversations with my father that I really wanted, they just didn't happen. And not only that, but politically, we were on the polar opposite side of the fence.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
we would get into these arguments, over things, which didn't make the relationship any better. Along the way, my mother said to me, Yvonne, you're going to have to go to your father. Your father isn't going to change
Mm.
if you want to have the relationship that I think you want to have with him. And so I changed how I dealt with dad, and we got along better and we talked about things, but it still wasn't
Mm.
where I thought it could be. So lo and behold, me not knowing where this was going to go and how this was going to end, in 2008, he told me a quirky, funny, off the wall story about making an emergency landing, of all things, in freed Belgium toward the end of the war. And I said, let me get a pencil and paper. I want to write this down. His
Yeah.
response was, what the hell do you want to do that for?
Right.
And I said, well, this is good. Maybe this is something that the family would really like to have.
Mhm.
So on the very next phone call, I said, hey, Dad, can you tell me more? Would you start at the beginning? And he did. And story after story after story came rolling off his tongue, all of which I took notes on. And in the process of me listening to those stories, a shift happened.
Mm.
And that shift was that he began to trust me with the deepest parts of himself. And I really remember when that happened. He had gone into the service. He was stationed, of all places, Miami Beach, for boot camp. And they were billeted in hotels. And so I said to Dad, what was the name of the hotel you were in? Oh, I don't remember. I said, well, where was it? He said, well, it was on Collins Avenue and da 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 da. And I said, well, let me do some research. So I started looking online, Collins Avenue and that. And I would send Dad pictures via email. No, that's not it. No, that's not it. Finally, he said, yeah, that's the one. Good work. Love you, Dad.
Mm.
And then the stories started to open up in a way that I hadn't expected. And because I was paying attention to him in this unique kind of way, I started to get the father that I always wanted.
Yeah.
And he got a daughter that he didn't know he had.
Right.
And it was all through my listening and paying attention. And the listening was different.
What do you
I,
mean? In what way?
I was keyed in to every word that he said.
Hmm.
And I was also listening for the emotion that was going on underneath. So I would say, well, what made you react like that? Or how was that for you? And then it just also shifted in that he started to say things like, imagine this. He's flying in an airplane, 22,000 feet above the ground. It's not a pressurized cabin. It is 40 to 60 degrees below zero. He's in the nose of a plane surrounded by plexiglass, not metal, but plexiglass. And they're flying through flak. And flak is incendiary bombs that are shot from down on the ground. When they get to the height of 22,000 feet, they explode and shrapnel goes everywhere.
Wow.
And that shrapnel could pierce the skin of these planes. And this was the first time he experienced flak. And he's watching planes go down around him. And he said to me, Yvonne, I was so scared, I peed myself.
Yeah.
And I short circuited my heat suit. So here he is,
Yeah.
22,000
Yeah.
feet above the ground. You know, it's 40 to 60 degrees below zero. Thank God he was the navigator. So he called on the interphone to the pilot and he said, we are about to reach the English Channel.
Mm.
Get this baby down to an altitude so I don't freeze to death.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those kinds of stories started coming out.
Right. These sort of deeper, where he's actually talking about fear, which I'm sure, given his growing up in a culture where men really didn't talk about feelings, this was maybe one of the first times he's talking about that with anyone.
I had never heard my father admit to being afraid of anything. And you're absolutely right. Feeling words were not a part of his vocabulary.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of conversation that I'd always wanted to have with Dad. That was the side of him that I really wanted to know. And later on in the storytelling, he told me about the recurring nightmare that he had when he came home from England.
Mm.
And for your audience, nightmares are indicative of PTSD.
Yes.
And the nightmare was this: his B 24 was going down. He was trying to get to where he could parachute out. And in the dream, in order to get to that spot, he had to go through this narrow passageway on his hands and knees. And he said the side of the passageway was stainless steel and he couldn't get purchase. There was nothing for him to dig in with his fingers to pull himself through.
Mm.
And mother would wake him up because he was screaming.
Yeah.
And she would say, Mike, what is it? And he would say, oh, it's nothing. Just go back to sleep. Oh, it's nothing was that he dug channels in the mattress on the bed. He broke through the sheets and dug channels to the point where he said to me, we had to throw that mattress out and buy a new one.
Yeah.
So I said to Dad, as a psychotherapist, I said, well, you know that your nightmares were normal given what you experienced. Here again, what the hell do you mean? So I explained how what he witnessed, the trauma of what he witnessed, was there deep in his brain.
Hmm.
And the nightmares were a way for him to try and work through that, and that they were normal.
Yeah.
anybody who would have witnessed the kinds of things that he witnessed would normally have these kinds of things happen. And I even explained the neurology around nightmares and things like that. So I literally heard my father's shoulders drop
Mm.
as I explained to him some 50 or 60 years after the event that he was normal and that those nightmares rather were normal. So being able to give to my father in that kind of a
Mm.
way, it doesn't get any better than that.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's an amazing experience. And I mean, I wonder how many of the greatest generation suffered, without in silence, right? They didn't have a daughter or a son or, someone like you in their life who could listen and be present. And they were so stoic and so proud, as they should have been, of all of what they had done. And yet by wearing that, it became kind of an armor, I guess is what I'm saying, such that they couldn't talk about it, and then suffered immensely without realizing that what they were experiencing was completely and utterly normal.
I responded to Dad by saying, "This makes me sad
Mm,
because they didn't know when you came home what we now know.
yeah,
They didn't have that information available. Had you had some help, you could have made those nightmares go away.
yeah.
You could have worked on it in a way that eventually, and sooner than 3 years, they would go away." And he said to me at the time, he said, "Well, when I came home, I would see all these other men that I knew were in the war, and we would stop and say hi and we would talk, and nobody talked about it."
Yeah.
And I said, "So that made you feel like what was going on with you was abnormal?"
Hmm.
And he said, "Yeah." And then, of course, we finished this conversation with sarcasm because we were really good at that. And I said, "So sorry, pal, you're still normal." And and that part of those conversations were ones that I will treasure for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I can sense the emotion from you and from the experience, the deep, profound connection that you got to have in these conversations where he was conveying his fears for the first time, but also in these lighthearted jabs that you would have with each other. These moments of sarcasm, to lighten the mood. And it's such a special thing that has happened, and I don't know if it's because you had experiences as a teacher, because you had training and experience as a psychotherapist, and because of your desire to have that deep relationship, your lifelong desire to have that deep relationship with your father. I mean, do you think it was a combination of all of those things, or was one more important, or was there something else that that made this possible, that these moments of these conversations with your father, the way that they were?
It's all of that.
Mm,
It's the being a teacher. It's
mhm.
the being the psychotherapist. It's working in a retirement community. It's the desire that I had to get to know him. My brother asked me, he said, "How did you get Dad to open up like
Mm,
that?" And my response was, I listened. I really, really listened. And the
mhm,
more I listened, and I said this earlier, the more it became that he was more relaxed and more willing to tell me the other parts that he had never told before. And some of them were oddly funny.
mhm,
When he was in Miami Beach, he contracted amoebic dysentery, and that gives you the runs.
mhm.
And he's on the beach doing calisthenics, and he's got to go. And on the beach, they had slit trenches dug. Now, these were deep holes in the sand, and there were poles on the side so you could hang on. He told me he dropped his drawers and fell in. So some of the guys came over and rescued him and pulled him out of this pit and threw him in the ocean.
Yeah.
And once he was a little bit cleaner, they picked him up and carted him off to the hospital. And then he said, I was treated with arsenic. I said, what? He said, yeah. He said, I was treated with arsenic. And I said, no, no, no way. So after that conversation, I thought, well, he can't be remembering it correctly. You know, the years have passed. Da, 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 da. So lo and behold, I start doing research. And he's absolutely correct. At the time that that happened to him, penicillin wasn't available. It had been discovered, but the discoverers were in England. And
Mm.
of course, they were knee deep in the war and they had no way to find a way to produce it cheaply. So they brought all of their knowledge to the United States. And in the United States, it was worked on. So by the time that the war ended in 45, penicillin was available. So there were quirky, that's what I mean, quirky, funny stories
Right.
that he would tell me that I would make me go like, what? you know, what?
Right.
Um,
Arsenic for
yeah,
dysentery?
arsenic.
Right.
Yeah. So it was a mixture of funny and tragic, and he met my mother during the war.
Mm. Say more about that. How did they meet?
Well, he was, I think, the sergeant at arms one night. So that meant what he had to do was he had to go around to the college. Um, he was he was at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and they had so many young men wanting to be pilots and wanting to get into the Air Force that they slowed the process down by giving them a semester in college. Physics, English, mathematics, those kinds of things that would be background to what it was they wanted these guys to do. All right, so Sergeant at Arms, it's his responsibility to go to all the dorms and check to make sure that everybody was in and lights out. And he goes to one room and there are 10 men missing. So knowing that this would mean a washout, that these guys would not be allowed to continue,
Mm.
he got in a Jeep and started driving all over Meadville, looking for them to tell them that they needed to turn themselves in the following morning, or he was honor bound to turn them in. So the last stop, and it starts in the rain, and by the way, it's cold, and the rain's coming down, and his last stop is the USO Club that my mother happened to be the head of.
Mm.
And she was 19 years old at this time. So he walks into the USO Club, and from the letters that he wrote later, her face must have been dirty because she was cleaning up. And he said to me, he said, I took one look at her, Yvonne, and I said, that's the woman I'm going to marry.
Wow.
They knew each other for 6 weeks in Meadville. And 6 months later, they were married. And that marriage lasted 58 years.
Yeah, he just knew, and she
He,
just knew.
yeah. And so those kinds of things would happen where I would understand. And dad was Roman Catholic, mother was Protestant. Neither sides of the family were happy about this union. So when they're in Texas, because dad went from Meadville to Texas to do more of the studying, when they're in Texas, in a letter, he writes to her that she needs to go and talk to someone in the church to find out about what they were allowed to do or not do sexually to prevent pregnancies. Well, it didn't go as planned.
Right.
And mom became pregnant.
Mm.
Okay. So he's happy. His writing is he's so excited to know that he's going to be a dad. But it affected the choices that he made.
Mm.
He could be in a program for 18 weeks to be a navigator, but it would have been an additional amount of time for him to become a pilot. And part of his decision was he wanted to be in a position where he was going to make more money because now he had a child on the way. So those kinds of stories came out,
Right.
you
Right.
know, family history things that I never knew.
Is there one story that really either surprised you or touched you deeply that you haven't already talked about, that you were really interested in telling in this book, that you really felt like people needed to know this story about your dad, to understand your dad and your relationship with your dad?
Yeah. When he finally got through navigation school, the next step was Charleston, South Carolina. And there he was going to meet the crew that he would train with until they went overseas. And he was late in arriving. And when a sergeant dropped him off at the Quonset hut or the Nissen hut, he went inside and there was one of the crew members waiting up for him. And this guy was keeping the hut warm till dad arrived. And once they said their hi, how are you, that kind of thing, the man's name was Jerry Pagan. And Jerry turned to my father and said, I have a very serious question to ask you. And dad said, what is it? And Jerry said, I'm Jewish. Does that bother you?
Mm,
And my dad said, well, what's your position? And Jerry said, I'm a bombardier.
mm,
And dad said, can you hit a target? Are you good at that? And Jerry said, yeah, I'm really good at that. And my dad said, well, that's all I care about.
yeah.
Now, this is the man that I had arguments with about race and ethnicity and all those kinds of things. And that and another story proved to me that my father's bark was much worse than his bite. That
Yeah.
what he would say out loud is not the way he would behave.
Mm.
So when presented with something, my father was very different from how he would have talked about things.
Do you think that was in part a product of his culture at the time and the upbringing at the time, meaning he was taught to believe a certain way, but when presented with the reality, he behaved really differently because then
Absolutely.
it was personal. Yeah.
Absolutely. When dad was interviewed by a psychiatrist when he was overseas and going on missions, what the psychiatrist said to my father was really insightful. He said, what is it about you Catholic boys that you seem so calm when you go out on a mission? And dad's response was, if I come back, it was God's will. If I don't come back, it was God's will. Now that's indicative
Mm,
of how deep Roman Catholicism or a belief in God was with my father.
mhm.
So that was really essential, I think, to what I always knew about him, because he always said to us, what's the right thing to do?
Mm,
What's the right thing to do? And that came from his faith.
mhm. And that seemed to guide his actions, maybe not his words all of the time, but
That's
his
right.
actions.
That's right. Absolutely. It guided his actions rather than his words.
Mm. Yeah, I want to move on and make sure we talk a little bit about your next book, Dying with Dad, because that kind of moves on to this next topic of um, it's a sensitive topic, and you deal with grief and very difficult, well, some people would call a very difficult decision. Can you tell us a little bit about what this book is about and what that really awful decision that anyone would have to make was?
So readers of the first book wanted to know how I could let my dad go when
Mm,
there might have been a possibility that he was saved. Dad and I had very intimate conversations about death and dying.
mm,
And that all happened because of my work in a retirement community.
mhm,
I had seen firsthand what happened to people when they didn't have an advance directive, when they didn't assign a healthcare agent that could speak for them when they could no longer speak for themselves. So I knew what Dad wanted.
mhm,
Not only did we do a legal attorney drawn up advance directive, but we also did something called the Five Wishes. And the Five Wishes is an advance directive on steroids and with lots of heart.
mm,
And it goes beyond just who's your healthcare agent and what do you want medically and what don't you want, to how do you want to be known? How do you want to be remembered?
mm,
What do you want your children to know? What does comfort mean to you? What do you want your funeral to look like? So when I discovered this document, I did it with Dad.
mm,
And and I knew the nitty gritty and the ins and outs. And he was very clear with me. He said, if I can be revived and have a decent quality of life, then yes, do it.
mm,
But if I can't be revived and have that quality of life, then I want you to let me go. So he had been in the hospital at Christmas time in 2009, and we had been there to visit. The social worker came to me and said, when can we send your dad home? And I said, when he's ready. Well, he was sent home. We had just gotten back to our home 6.5 hours away from Dad. He called on the phone. He was livid.
mm,
I'm holding the phone out here, like feet against from my ear, because he said, why did you tell them that I could go home? And I said, when he stopped ranting and raving, I said, well, I told them when you were ready, and it doesn't sound like you're ready.
mm, mhm,
And he said, Yvonne, can you come home? I'm scared.
mm,
Can you take a leave of absence? I said, I'll be there tomorrow. And I was home 2.5 hours. And we found Dad face down. The neighbors and I found Dad face down in his bedroom.
mm,
I called EMTs. I'm not a nurse. I don't know, So they came. We got him out to the end of his bed. And the EMT said to me, it's not looking good.
mm,
And then I took the Five Wishes down, showed it to one of them, and he said, I don't think we can use these. They're too old. That
mm,
I no longer believe to be true. So without thinking, Melissa, I got on the phone, called the hospital, said, they're bringing Dad in. Please honor his do not resuscitate. The emergency room doctor called the EMTs and said, you can stop working on him.
mm,
So I laid down beside him, put my arm over his chest, told him that I loved him, told him that he was going to be with Mom where he wanted to be. And then I did what was the glue in our family. I said the Lord's Prayer in his ear, and he was gone.
yeah.
I never thought to do anything otherwise. Truly, I was on automatic pilot, that my father had told me what it was that he wanted. And by dingity dang, that's what I was going to do. It never occurred to me to question that. So my father said frequently throughout his life, I mean, this was something that we all knew. I want to be carried feet first out of my own home. And that's what happened.
Mm.
So the EMT said to me, "You can ride in the ambulance. We need to take your father in to have his death be pronounced." So I walked down the steps outside, and they had the gurney. They hadn't put it in the ambulance yet, but the doors of the ambulance were open. There's snow falling,
Mm.
an inch an hour. The light is shining on my dad's face. And there's this soft, sweet smile. And I went, yes. And the EMTs looked at me like I'd lost any marble I might have had. And I
Yeah.
said, thank you. You just fulfilled my father's wish.
Mm.
Feet first out of his own home. So dying with dad is my journey of being comfortable talking about death and dying. I learned to do that with the residents at the retirement community. I
Mhm.
learned to do that because my clients would talk to me about wanting to go as a therapist.
Yeah.
So, yes, they were difficult conversations. I sweated it 6.5 hours driving across the state with this 5 wishes packet sitting on the front seat. Like, how am I going to introduce this? Is he
Mm.
going to yell at me? What's he going to say?
Mm.
What do we need to do this all over again for?
Yeah.
How is he going to take it? But I walked into his room, and that was like years before he finally passed away, and he was open. I
Mhm.
said, I have another thing that I want to go over with you. Can we do this? He shifted from his bed. He put his legs over the side of the bed, patted the seat beside him. I sat down in what had been his warmth. And there on that tray table beside his bed, we went through, how do you want to be remembered? My work with the Red Cross.
Mm.
Well, what about your service during the war? Well, that too. What do you want the family to know? I want them to know that I love them,
Mm.
that they were the best part of my life. Do you want to be buried or do you want to be cremated? He said, I want to be buried. And then we went through the funeral service. He said, um, your husband, my husband Kirk, has a delightful tenor voice.
Mm.
And he said, your husband will sing Amazing Grace, the Ave Maria, and the Lord's Prayer. And you kids, you choose the readings. I don't care. He said, oh, and by the way, you know that thing where people stand up and say stuff about you during the service? I don't want that.
Mm.
Because people haven't said it to my face, then I damn well don't want them to say it at my funeral. So all this stuff was a part of the 5 wishes. But going back to your original question, it never occurred to me to do anything other than make sure my father went feet first out of his own home.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's very moving. And what occurs to me is this thread of presence that you had with your father from, that first phone call, the moment where he tells this quirky story and there's your in, to the moment of his death where you are present for him to witness the smile on his face and the snow falling and the light. And then to fulfilling, his wishes about how he wanted his funeral to be, and what an example that is for the rest of us, who may or may not have close relationships with our parents or other older loved ones, and how there's this opportunity, even late in the day, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
to have that kind of closeness if we just listen and we ask questions. and we're just present.
Absolutely. Now, as a therapist, there's a caveat that I feel compelled to say.
Mm-hmm.
Some relationships with parents are toxic. And if they're toxic, they can't be repaired.
Yeah.
But if there is the kind of relationship that I had with my father, where there was give and take and there
Mm-hmm.
was love, knew it, then having these conversations is absolutely, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's heartwarming.
Mm-hmm.
Is it hard? Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But talking about death and dying is like the elephant in the room. We all
Mm-hmm.
know it's going to happen, but we're scared to death. But I so treasure those conversations with Dad because they opened up this way of Dad and I being. I wish everybody had that.
Yeah.
That's my passion. I wish everyone had it.
And how do you think, like, so for those who might have an estranged, unrepairable relationship with their parent, how might they too find this kind of intimacy or presence, maybe with a stranger, maybe with someone they know? Like, what would you suggest so we can invite more intimacy and maybe talking about really difficult subjects in our everyday lives? How would we do that?
The first thing that came to mind is what we can do is we can have these conversations with our children.
Mm,
We can go ahead and we can do an advance directive or the
mm,
5 wishes,
mhm,
and we can bring our children into that discussion. And hopefully they are willing to go there. Now,
mhm,
one of the beauties of the book is that someone came back to me and said, before I read your book, I wouldn't have that discussion with my parents. They tried.
mhm.
But after reading your book, I now am open and we've started those discussions.
Yeah.
So, um, what we can do is we can do it with our children.
Mhm,
The other thing that came to mind with me is that had I had a toxic relationship with my parents, I would have talked to my best friend. And
mm,
I know she would have been very open to going to through the 5 wishes with me.
mhm.
You know, as it stands, I've done the 5 wishes. My daughter and my 2 stepchildren, we've all had honest discussions about what it is that I want and how I want it. So those discussions are as priceless as the one I had with my father. So we could be a friend to someone in need, or we could have those discussions with our own children.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, and I think you mentioned this earlier. We're not so good at having conversations in our culture about death and dying, and yet we all know it's inescapable. This is going to happen, but yet we put it out of mind. And it's really interesting because some other cultures are not like that. I'm aware there's a Buddhist practice. I don't know that all Buddhists do this, but there's a Buddhist practice about contemplating one's own death, not in any sort of morbid way, but just to become more present for what is in one's life. And there's even a practice where I think some monks will go view different corpses. Sounds really challenging, but corpses in different states of decay to help them contemplate their own death and what that means. I think probably to really appreciate what they have in the present moment. I'm sure there's a lot of other deep philosophical understanding that I'm missing here, but we don't do that in our culture. And so here's this opportunity to get to know what is really important to someone in this life. How do you want to be remembered?
Mhm.
That's what a beautiful question to start with. And we probably need to answer that for ourselves first and then share it. We need to know, how do I want to be remembered?
I remember taking a class, And one of the assignments was to write my own obituary.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really powerful because in the way that you described with the Buddhist monks, it made me sit back and think, what is important? How do I want to be remembered? What's my purpose on life? Why
Yeah.
am I here? And we miss that opportunity if we don't talk about it or if we don't think
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. Agreed. And it's so important, and what an incredible opportunity for the intimacy I think we all seek with, whether it's a parent or a child or a friend or spouse, or all of them, that we can have these conversations, that we don't just talk about, "Well, how was your day?" That's all wonderful too. We don't
Mm-hmm.
always have to have deep conversations. We can have playful banter, as you did with your father, but it's really important to have these meaningful conversations with the persons that we love, including ourselves.
I had 3 experiences with people. You have beta readers, okay, and they read the book before it ever goes to publication. And one of them I already told you about. And she and her parents have now done the 5 wishes, and she's done the 5 wishes for herself. Another was my publisher's father,
Mm.
who had read Flying with Dad. So I called him and we talked about death and dying, that kind of stuff. He said, I've never thought about it. It's never occurred to me that I needed to do something like this. So somewhere down the track, he calls his daughters and says, for my birthday, I want to do a Zoom call and I want to talk about my 5 wishes. I have them done. And so they did. And in the conversation, it comes up, do you want to be buried or do you want to be cremated? And he said, I want to be cremated. Well, Dad, what do you want us to do with your ashes? Well, I don't care, throw them over a bridge. And they said, wait a minute, wouldn't you like to have your ashes taken out to the farm where you were raised as a kid? And he said, well, that's too much trouble. And the response was, well, what if we'd like to do that for you?
Mm.
He said, you'd really like to do that for me? And they said, yes. He had grown up in a 1-room farmhouse on the prairies in Canada.
Hmm.
And he has since changed his 5 wishes to include that in them. So this back and forth conversation. The third one is the most powerful. One of the women in my writers group had an acute illness that left her with surgery after surgery after surgery.
Mm.
And when she read Dying with Dad, she got the 5 wishes and she did it and she discussed it with her family. And we got word that she had chosen hospice.
Mm.
And her husband set up an opportunity for us to do a Zoom call with her. And I jumped on that.
Yeah.
So we're on this Zoom call, and she kept thanking me. I didn't say much. The 5 wishes are so important, Yvonne. Thank you.
Mm.
My family knows and agrees with what I want. Thank you. I feel such freedom having made this decision. Thank you. What's better than that?
Yeah.
And I think it was no more than several days later, she passed away.
Yeah. I mean, we can want, I think, nothing more in life to feel like our wishes were heard and honored, and have that opportunity, as we've already discussed, to have that intimacy with the people that we love the most. Yeah, it's beautiful.
It has changed the grief process for me.
Hmm.
Do I miss my dad? Oh, absolutely. Are there still times when I burst into tears missing him? Absolutely. Would I have him back in my life for one more pot roast dinner? so I could pummel him with questions and get more information? Absolutely. But every time his picture and mom's picture is right over here, every time I look at that picture, there is this sacred joy that I feel. The paradox, and I say this in the book, of doing something difficult to achieve something beautiful. The paradox is contained within this orb of grief. I have sadness and longing, but I also have sacred joy.
Yeah.
I don't have that with my mother.
Mm.
I don't have that with my brother. I've got the longing, I've got the sorrow, but because we didn't know, I wasn't able to do those kinds of things with mom and my brother.
Yeah.
So there's a preparation that we can do that will ease the grief that we're bound to experience when we lose somebody that we love.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think this is a good place to maybe wind things up. What a beautiful place to wind it up, that you could have this opportunity to, yes, have longing and grief and sorrow, but to have that sacred joy by connecting with your loved one in this way, using the five wishes as a tool. You don't have to make it up, it's already done for you. And the only thing that you need to do is be present with your loved one with it and honor it.
And you talk about mindfulness.
Mhm.
That's mindfulness at the core.
Yep. Yeah. Well, how can people find your books? Where do they find you? How do they read them?
If you like independent bookstores,
Hmm.
walk in, say, Yvonne Caputo, I'd like to order these books, Flying with Dad and Dying with Dad. Barnes and Noble, Amazon. If you want to connect with me, it's Yvonne author 4 at gmail.com. YVONNEAUTHOR, the number 4 at gmail.com. And I will plug, if you read the books, I would really appreciate a review.
Yes. Those are
Those,
always so helpful, right?
you know,
Yes.
hosting a podcast, you know, and they're important to anybody who has a business. So yeah, that's the way that they can find the books.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate your vulnerability, your authorship, your presence, and being here today and talking with me about your books, your work, your relationship with your father, and the five wishes. Thank you. It's been an
Oh, you're
honor.
welcome. Honor here too. Thank you.
Thank you.